Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidir. The time is 8:35 Central African Time. Very beautiful morning here in Johannesburg. A bit grey, but hey, we move. We're going to be moving on now to our hashtag Africa Focus feature. This is a part of the show where we turn our attention to some of the biggest stories on the African continent, what we feel needs a bit more attention than it is getting. And this time around, we'll be turning our attention to a rather dramatic and swiftly unfolding story from Madagascar, where political turmoil has reached a new peak. President Andre Rajoelina is reported to have fled the country after losing the support of a key military unit. And once a rising power broke in the country, Rajoelina now finds himself isolated with the elite Capsat military unit, instrumental in his own earlier rise, joining forces with youth protesters demanding changes. And to help us unpack what's really happening in Madagascar, the significance of these events, their roots, implications for governance and stability, and what they might mean for Africa a bit more broadly, where we've seen these kinds of demonstrations, these protests that are led largely by young people popping up, in various countries on the continent. Kenya comes to mind. Various other countries, Rwanda also comes to mind. They had protests earlier on in the year, and I think it was the Ivory Coast also, where we've seen more and more of these protests and uprisings, essentially, if you want to call, that are led by young people who are calling for change and calling for it now. And we will now be joined by Dr. Gwinyai Taruvinga, a research and political science lecturer at the University of the Witwatersrand. Good morning, Doc. Thank you so much for joining us here on News and Views. Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you so much. I hope you're doing well.
No, most definitely. I think let's jump right into it. Madagascar is not a country that you see on the news very often, and I think it'll be justice to our listeners to just start with the basics. What's currently happening in Madagascar right now? What do we know so far? And what is happening to President Rajoelina?
So thank you again. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So Madagascar, as you've said, is really on the news, and whenever they are on the news, it's normally about some sort of political instability. But what's currently happening in Madagascar at the moment, I think, is representative of the challenges that the African continent is facing within the context of democracy, within the context of independent institutions, as well as also within the context of the role of the military. So Madagascar specifically, I think, within the Southern African context, also allows us to understand these particular dynamics. So with Madagascar again, the main issue was the fact that there were protests that were led by the youth. I think you mentioned this in your introduction when you spoke about what happened in several other African countries. But what also comes to mind is what happened in Nepal recently, where the youth, so-called Gen Z, basically took to the streets to protest against what was happening in Nepal, so the role of the government and this failure of governments to provide, but more importantly, raising awareness of issues such as corruption and how these have impacted the youth. So this is similar to what happened in Madagascar, where there was, water shortages, there was, shortages in electricity, and this essentially caused a lot of protests that have basically made life very difficult for the current sitting president.
What's interesting for me, and as I was doing a bit of reading and research on the current state of affairs in Madagascar, there was one phrase or one word that kept popping out: Capsat military unit. Can you give us a bit more insight on how significant is the defection or alignment of the Capsat military unit in the context of Madagascar's politics, and what does that tell us about power dynamics within the state itself?
So Capsat, I think, is a very crucial element and a power broker in Madagascar. So I think you also mentioned this in your introduction, where you said President Rajoelina's basically his rise to ascendance to power was in 2009, and this also ironically was through a military coup that was backed by Capsat. So Capsat essentially is the military entity in Madagascar, and them aligning with the protesters, I think, is a significant shift, and I think Hence, we're now hearing these rumors of the president apparently having fled the country as a result of this particular aspect of Capset now joining the protesters. But what's also very interesting about Capset, I think it also speaks to the dynamics behind a military coup. So a lot of the
Mm,
thinkers who talk about military coups often talk about how there's normally a turning point and there's also what they call a trigger. So something that then triggers the army to react. So in this case, the army, I think, has reacted because clearly President Rajoelina is losing power, and basically also the country at large is really unhappy with his leadership. So the army, as a power broker, tends to intervene in this particular cases. So we've seen this in several African countries. We saw this in 2017 in Zimbabwe. We saw this in Gabon. We've also seen this in Mali. We've seen this in Nigeria with the historical coups that have happened in those particular countries. So essentially, Capset is a huge power broker, and I think this is sort of really basically fanned the flames that have been started by the youth and the protests in Madagascar.
mm, mm, mm.
Yes.
Um, I want to come back to, just broadly, these protests that we've seen on the continent, and just this shift of politics where it seems and feels like Gen Zs or young people are becoming a bit more active when it comes to, challenging the status quo of what is traditionally being known as what leadership looks like on the African continent, and how it is interacted with. As I mentioned, Kenya comes to mind, Rwanda comes to mind, even our neighbors in Mozambique after the elections. I think there was a big uproar on how the elections were handled. This new wave of young people, Gen Zs, and the interaction with the old guard of African leadership. Is this going to be a trend? Is this something that we should, appreciate because of the direction that, the ones that liberated us from the colonial yoke have ultimately seen the continent take the direction that is taken currently?
Yes, so I think I really like your question because again, I think it puts into perspective the dynamics on the African continent. So if you look at any country, normally when the political weaknesses or political failures by the government, it's normally the youth that is affected. If you look historically as well, in the fights that you've mentioned of liberation, the fights against apartheid in South Africa, it was the youth that were at the forefront of these particular movements. So what we are currently seeing at the moment is a reflection of that, where we're seeing that these democratic processes that were introduced after the attainment of independence haven't necessarily yielded the results that people have hoped for in terms of job creation, in terms of economies that are basically growing and being more inclusive. And again, it is the youth who bear the brunt of that. So essentially, you have an educated population that is, got master's degrees, PhDs, but are unable to basically gain employment. And as a result of that, it causes a lot of frustrations. And this is what we're continuously seeing on the African continent. And also, just to add to that as well, we find that, in political theory, I think the theorist's name is Gramsci. One of the arguments he makes is that what certain countries find themselves in is sort of a dichotomy where you have the old guard, so which is basically your nationalist movements, who
Mm,
are sort of fading away through natural causes. So certain leaders are older, and now you also then have the opposition that's also trying to gain power, but are struggling to gain power because of institutional failures in certain countries. And then in between that, you then have the youth who are sort of caught in between these two dichotomies. And as a result of that, they're then left with no option but then to raise awareness through protests. So we saw this in 2011 with the Arab Spring. We're also again currently seeing this same system manifesting itself currently in Nepal, which is not in Africa, but it gives us a very
mm.
good example that we can use. And also some of the examples that you raised, especially Kenya, because it also speaks again to this dynamic of democracy and how this interaction with the old guard always has to end up with a radical shift, as we're seeing in Madagascar.
Well, there you have it, Gwinyai. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for chatting to us. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I hope we chat again soon.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
There you go, Gwinyai Taruvinga, researcher with the Wits Global Institute, giving us an insight on what's currently happening in Madagascar, where, yeah, the similarly political turmoil. The president alleges coup as an army unit defects, essentially saying, "Well, you need to get out, buddy." And I think it's interesting. It's an interesting kind of period that the African continent is experiencing right now, and I think as South Africans, you just think to yourself, how much longer can the youth here in South Africa, just looking at the examples from other parts of the continent, Mozambique, Kenya, even not in the continent, as you heard from Gwinyai there, in Nepal, where young people essentially took to the streets and said, "You said we must get an education. You said we must be law abiding, patriotic citizens. We've done everything that you said needs to be done. We got our degrees, our masters. We are ready to serve and work for this country, but we are largely going ignored. There's deterioration, there's corruption, nothing is working, and we are at a working age. We are young and healthy. We want to contribute to this country, but we're being shut out because of your your failures for the past 30 years of this country. And well, nothing's being done. Ultimately, how much longer will the youth of South Africa, which, according to stats, have the highest unemployment rate found anywhere in the world? And these examples just keep popping out: Kenya, Rwanda, Nepal, now Madagascar. And historically, you look back, June 16, 1976, it always feels like in every period, there's going to be young people who are saying, "Well, enough is enough. We are tired of the current state of affairs. It's not working for us, and we've ticked all the right boxes, but we're still finding ourselves at the bottom of the barrel." So, yeah, I think interesting insights, and very, very interesting to look at what's happening in those different parts of the continent, and looking at South Africa and just how similar we are with them. It's been hashtag Africa Focus feature. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, news and views continues.